Zara Mitchell stared at the collection notice taped to her apartment door, her hands trembling as she read the amount due, $3,847. Behind her, the empty hallway echoed with the sound of her neighbor's television, a stark reminder that life continued, normally for everyone else, while hers crumbled piece by piece. She fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the door to her studio apartment. The space felt smaller each day, cluttered with medical equipment and pill bottles that had become the landscape of her new reality. The adjustable bed dominated the room, a constant reminder of the accident that had changed everything. 8 months ago, the diving accident had happened so fast. One moment she was executing a perfect pike dive at the community pool where she trained, preparing for the Olympic trials that had been her dream since childhood. The next moment, she was underwater, unable to move her legs, watching her future dissolve in chlorinated water. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic at first. Incomplete spinal cord injury, they said. With the right treatment, intensive physical therapy, and cutting-edge spinal stimulation technology, she might regain significant function, might even walk again. But insurance had other ideas. Experimental, they called the treatment. Not medically necessary for basic life functions. The appeals process had dragged on for months, each denial letter feeling like another door slamming shut. Meanwhile, the bills kept coming. Hospital stays, medications, basic equipment, it all added up to an impossible mountain of debt. Zara's savings account, once healthy from her part-time job coaching swim lessons, had evaporated within the first 3 months. Her parents, already struggling with her father's recent heart surgery, had emptied their retirement fund to help. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She lowered herself carefully onto her bed, her legs heavy and unresponsive below the knees. The partial sensation she retained felt more like a cruel joke than a blessing enough feeling to know what she was missing, not enough to actually use. The doctors said the experimental treatment could change that. Electrical stimulation combined with intensive therapy had shown remarkable results in patients with similar injuries. Some had walked out of the clinic. The cost was $80,000 for the full program. Zara reached for her laptop, a ritual she'd been performing every evening for the past month. She scrolled through fundraising websites, medical assistance programs, and charity organizations. Most had waiting lists years long. Others required her to share her story publicly, to become a poster child for medical fundraising campaigns. The thought made her stomach turn. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't looking for charity. She was looking for a chance to be whole again, to feel like herself instead of this broken version that needed help reaching items on high shelves, and couldn't shower without a plastic chair. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former teammate Jessica. Missing you at practice. The team qualified for regionals. Wish you were here to celebrate with us. Zara stared at the message until her vision blurred. Jessica meant well, but each reminder of her old life felt like salt in an open wound. Her teammates had sent flowers. When she was first hospitalized, visited a few times during her initial recovery. But as the months passed, and it became clear this wasn't a temporary setback, the visits became less frequent, and stopped altogether. They were moving forward with their lives, with their dreams. She was stuck in this apartment, watching the world through a window she couldn't quite reach. The collection notice crinkled in her hand as she looked around her apartment. Tomorrow she would have to call the billing department again, try to negotiate another payment plan she couldn't afford. She would have to smile and sound hopeful while explaining that yes, she understood the importance of paying her debts, but no, she didn't currently have $3,847 lying around. Outside her window, the city sparkled with evening lights. Somewhere out there, people were living their dreams, pursuing their goals, taking their mobility for granted. Zara pressed her palm against the cool glass and tried to remember what it felt like to move through water with powerful, coordinated strokes. She closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She would find a way. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would find a way to get that treatment. She would walk again, swim again, live again. She just had to figure out how to afford hope. 3 weeks later, Zara found herself staring at a website she never thought she'd visit. The laptop screen glowed in her darkened apartment, casting blue shadows across her face as she read testimonials from young women who claimed to have found generous benefactors online. Connections Elite. The name sounded respectable enough, almost like a networking site for professionals. But Zara knew better. She'd spent hours researching, reading forums, and trying to understand this world she was contemplating entering. The euphemisms were everywhere. Mutually beneficial arrangements, companionship for successful gentlemen, investment in your future. Her finger hovered over the Create Profile button. 2 days ago, she'd received another denial letter from her insurance company. This time, they'd included a cheerful pamphlet about adapting to your new normal and finding fulfillment within your limitations. She'd thrown it across the room, papers scattering like her shattered dreams. The collection calls had started coming daily now. Her landlord had left a voicemail about next month's rent. Her physical therapist, the only one who still believed in her recovery, had gently mentioned that without continuing treatment, the small improvements she'd made might regress. Zara created the profile with shaking hands. She chose photos carefully, ones that showed her smile, her face, her upper body strength from years of swimming. Nothing that revealed the wheelchair folded in her closet or the way her legs lay motionless beneath blankets. She wasn't trying to deceive anyone, she told herself. She was just presenting her best self. Writing the description proved harder than any essay she'd written in college. How do you explain that you're not really offering what most men on these sites wanted? That you were a former athlete with dreams bigger than your current circumstances? Recent college graduate facing unexpected medical challenges, she finally typed. Seeking a mentor who values intelligence, determination, and meaningful conversation. I'm working toward groundbreaking spinal treatment that could change my life and help others facing similar challenges. Looking for someone who invests in potential, not just appearance. She added details about her love of literature, her knowledge of sports psychology, her dream of one day becoming a motivational speaker for adaptive athletes. Maybe someone would see beyond the obvious and understand what she was really asking for. The responses came faster than she'd expected. Her phone buzzed constantly for the first hour after posting. Zara's heart sank as she opened message after message. Most were exactly what she'd feared. Crude propositions from men who'd clearly skipped over everything except her photos. Hey, beautiful, I can be very generous with the right arrangement. What are you willing to do for $500 a night? I have a hotel room downtown. When can you come over? Each message felt like a small violation, reducing her to nothing more than a commodity. Some men sent photos she definitely hadn't requested. Others made assumptions about her desperation that made her skin crawl. But scattered among the garbage were a few messages that seemed different. A man calling himself Successful Executive had written politely, asking about her situation and mentioning that he understood medical expenses could be overwhelming. Another, Book Lover 58, had actually read her profile and asked thoughtful questions about her educational background. Zara spent 3 hours crafting responses to the 5 men who seemed most promising. She explained her situation more clearly, that she was partially paralyzed, that she needed help with medical expenses, that she was looking for genuine mentorship rather than physical arrangements. 3 never wrote back. 1 asked invasive questions about her disability that made her uncomfortable. The last one, Successful Executive, suggested meeting for dinner at an upscale restaurant. She spent a day preparing for the meeting, borrowing a nice dress from her former roommate and practicing transfers from her wheelchair to a regular chair. The restaurant he'd chosen was elegant, with dim lighting and cloth napkins, the kind of place where she used to celebrate meet victories with her family. The man who showed up looked nothing like his profile photo. He was much older, wore a wedding ring he kept trying to hide, and his eyes held a calculating coldness that made Zara immediately uncomfortable. "So you're the girl with the medical problems," he said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from her. "I have to say, you look normal enough from what I can see." The conversation went downhill from there. He peppered her with questions about her limitations, asked repeatedly what she was willing to do for financial help, and made it clear. He expected their arrangement to include services she had no intention of providing. "Look, honey," he said, leaning across the table when she tried to explain her actual situation. "Disabled girls can't be picky. You need money. I have money. It's simple supply and demand." Zara left the restaurant feeling dirty and humiliated. She sat in the parking lot, calling a rideshare with trembling hands, and cried until her makeup ran. The driver asked if she was okay, and she could only nod and give him her address. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was what desperation looked like. The man's words echoed in her mind. Disabled girls can't be picky? Was that really how the world saw her now? As damaged goods who should be grateful for any attention. Her phone buzzed with new messages from the website. More of the same. Men who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity, who thought her medical needs made her easy to manipulate. One had somehow figured out where she lived and sent her address in a message. Just to prove he could find her, Zara deleted her profile. That night, but not before screenshotting some of the worst messages. She wanted to remember this feeling, this moment when she realized that desperation could make you consider things you never thought possible. She wanted to remember so she would never let herself get this low again. But as she closed the laptop, the bills on her desk seemed to mock her resolution. The collection notices weren't going away. The treatment she needed wasn't getting any cheaper. And her savings account balance was still a stark, unforgiving zero. Tomorrow, she would have to find another way. Tonight, she allowed herself to grieve. For the innocence she'd lost in that restaurant booth, when a stranger made her feel worthless because of circumstances beyond her control. Dr. Marcus Webb rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock on his office wall. 11:47 p.m. Another late night at the Riverside Spinal Rehabilitation Center, catching up on patient files and research proposals. The building was quiet except for the hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of late-shift nurses making their rounds. Marcus had always been a night owl, but lately his insomnia had gotten worse. It had been 3 years since his younger brother Jake's death, but some nights the guilt still kept him awake. Jake had suffered a similar spinal injury in a motorcycle accident, but their family's insurance situation had been different then. Marcus was already an established physician, able to advocate effectively and pay for treatments that might have helped. Jake had recovered partially, enough to live independently and pursue his passion for adaptive sports. But the depression that came with his changed circumstances proved harder to treat than the physical injuries. One night, Jake had simply given up fighting. Marcus blamed himself for not seeing the signs, for focusing so much on Jake's physical recovery that he missed the emotional battle his brother was losing. Now he threw himself into his work, specializing in spinal cord injuries and fighting insurance companies for his patients with a fervor that sometimes surprised his colleagues. Tonight, he'd finished reviewing files for next week's patients and found himself restlessly browsing medical forums and research sites. He wasn't sure how he ended up on a more general website, reading posts from people seeking help with medical expenses. Maybe he was looking for insight into what his patients faced outside his clinic walls. That's when he found Zara's post. Something about her writing immediately caught his attention. Unlike other posts that seemed focused on transactions, hers radiated genuine determination. She mentioned her swimming background, her dreams of recovery, her desire to help others facing similar challenges. The medical details she included were accurate and specific. This wasn't someone seeking easy money, but someone who truly understood her condition and treatment options. Marcus studied her photos more carefully. In one image, he could see the edge of what looked like a hospital bed in the background. Another showed her upper body strength, the developed shoulders and arms of a serious swimmer. But it was her eyes that convinced him she was legitimate. They held the same mixture of hope and determination he saw in his most successful patients. He'd never reached out to someone through a website like this before, but something about Zara's situation reminded him so strongly of Jake's journey that he felt compelled to help. Not in the way other men on these sites probably offered help, but in a way that could actually make a difference. Marcus had been working on a research grant proposal for months, studying outcomes in spinal cord injury patients who received early intervention with electrical stimulation therapy. The grant was still pending, but Marcus had savings from his practice and a trust fund Jake had left him, specifically designated for helping other people with spinal injuries. He crafted his message carefully, introducing himself with his real credentials and explaining his legitimate research interest. He wasn't making false promises. The documentation aspect would be real and valuable for other patients. But more importantly, he could provide the funding Zara needed without expecting anything inappropriate in return. After sending the message, Marcus immediately worried he'd made a mistake. What if Zara thought he was just another person trying to take advantage of her desperation? What if she researched him and found out about Jake, thinking Marcus was just trying to assuage his own guilt? But when Zara's response came the next day, he could sense her cautious hope. She'd clearly researched his credentials thoroughly. She mentioned his published papers on spinal rehabilitation and asked specific questions about his current research. Her intelligence and thoroughness impressed him. Their email exchanges over the next few days revealed someone who understood her medical condition better than many of his patients. Zara had done extensive research on treatment options, understood the risks and benefits of various approaches, and had realistic expectations about recovery timelines. She wasn't looking for miracles. She was looking for a genuine chance at improvement. When they arranged to meet at his clinic, Marcus found himself more nervous than usual. He'd helped many patients navigate insurance denials and financial hardships. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that both inspired and worried him. Zara arrived precisely on time, transferring smoothly from her rideshare vehicle to a lightweight wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Marcus was struck immediately by her composure and dignity. Despite everything she'd been through, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had once been at the top of her game. "Dr. Webb?" she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that spoke to her athletic background. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I have to admit, I'm still not entirely sure this is real." Marcus showed her around the facility, introducing her to other patients and staff members. He watched her face as she observed people working with various adaptive technologies, seeing the mixture of hope and determination in her eyes that he remembered from Jake's early days of recovery. In his office, they discussed the practical aspects of her situation. Marcus explained his research goals honestly. He did want to document the journey of someone receiving advanced treatment, both for his own clinical understanding and to help other patients and families understand what was possible. "I have too." "Ask," Zara said finally, her directness reminding him of Jake's no-nonsense approach to difficult conversations. "Why are you doing this? What do you really get out of helping me?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, then showed her a photo from his desk. Him and Jake at a Paralympic swimming event, both grinning and wearing Team USA t-shirts. My brother had a similar injury to yours. He made remarkable physical progress, but the system failed him in other ways. I've learned that healing isn't just about the medical treatment. It's about hope, dignity, and feeling like someone believes in your potential. He told her about Jake's recovery, his achievements in adaptive sports, and his struggle with depression that the medical system hadn't adequately addressed. He didn't tell her about how Jake's story ended. That seemed too heavy for a first meeting, but he wanted her to understand his motivation was both personal and professional. I can't promise miraculous results, Marcus said, but I can promise you'll receive the best possible treatment and the respect you deserve throughout the process. And if the treatment works as well as we hope, your documented journey could help dozens of other people in similar situations get the coverage they need. Zara was quiet for a long time, studying the photo of Marcus and Jake. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. When can we start? 6 weeks into Zara's treatment program, Marcus watched from the observation window as she worked with the electrical stimulation device, her face a mask of intense concentration. The progress had been slower than either of them had hoped, but it was definitely there. Yesterday, she'd managed to flex her left ankle voluntarily for the first time since the accident. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, sweat beading on her forehead as she focused on the signals her brain was sending to her legs. Just a little more. The physical therapy sessions were grueling. 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, combining electrical stimulation with intensive movement training. Marcus had arranged for her to work with his best therapist, Denise, who had developed innovative techniques for patients with incomplete spinal injuries. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that made the process difficult. In the weeks since their partnership began, Marcus had learned about the psychological toll of Zara's experience with the online world. She'd shared some of the messages she'd received, the humiliation of that restaurant meeting, the way desperation had nearly led her to compromise her values and safety. "I felt like I was disappearing," she'd told him during one of their documentation sessions. "Like my identity as an athlete, as an intelligent person, as someone with goals and dreams, just evaporated. All anyone could see was damaged goods who should be grateful for attention." Those conversations had been difficult for Marcus too, reminding him of Jake's struggles with depression and self-worth after his injury. He'd started having Zara meet with Dr. Patricia Chun, a psychologist who specialized in helping athletes adapt to life-changing injuries. The mental health component was just as important as the physical therapy. Today's session was different, though. Marcus could see it in the set of Zara's shoulders, the determined expression that reminded him of the competitive swimmer she'd once been. Something had shifted in her mindset over the past week. "Dr. Webb," Denise called from the therapy room. "You need to see this." Marcus hurried into the room, just as Zara managed to lift her right leg 3 inches off the table using her own muscle control. It was the most significant voluntary movement she'd achieved since beginning treatment. "Holy shit," Zara breathed, then immediately covered her mouth. "Sorry, I know I shouldn't curse in a medical facility." "Are you kidding?" Marcus laughed, making notes in her chart. "That deserves a celebration, not an apology. How does it feel?" "Weird," Zara admitted, lowering her leg carefully. "Like the signals are getting through, but they're still traveling through molasses. But it's definitely my leg doing the work, not just the stimulation device." Over the following weeks, the improvements came steadily. Zara regained enough function to stand with assistance, then to take a few halting steps using parallel bars. Each milestone was documented carefully, both for Marcus's research and for Zara's own record of her journey. But the real transformation Marcus observed was in Zara's confidence. She'd started participating in the clinic's support groups, sharing her story with other patients and offering encouragement to those just beginning their recovery journey. Her natural leadership abilities, honed by years of competitive swimming, were reasserting themselves. "I want to expand the documentation project," Zara told him one afternoon, after a particularly successful therapy session. "Not just my story, but other patients' experiences too. I'm realizing how many people face the same insurance battles, the same financial obstacles, the same predatory situations I encountered." Marcus had been thinking along similar lines. Zara's case was providing valuable data, but her insights into the patient experience were equally important. She understood firsthand the gaps in the system, the places where people fell through cracks or were forced into dangerous situations by circumstances beyond their control. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "A foundation," Zara said, her eyes bright with the same intensity she'd once brought to swim training. "Something that helps bridge the gap between medical necessity and financial reality. Not just charity, partnership. Investing in people's potential, not pitying their circumstances." She pulled out a notebook filled with ideas she'd been developing. Programs to help patients navigate insurance appeals. A fund to cover treatment. Costs for people caught in coverage gaps. Most importantly, a support system to protect vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation she'd nearly fallen victim to. "I want to make sure no one else has to consider what I considered," she said quietly. "No one should have to choose between their dignity and their chance at recovery." Marcus found himself impressed not just by her ideas, but by her determination to transform her painful experience into something that could help others. It reminded him of Jake's best qualities, his desire to advocate for other people with disabilities, his refusal to let his injury define his worth. 3 months into treatment, Zara took her first unassisted steps. It was only 10 feet, and she needed to rest afterward, but she walked from the parallel bars to Marcus's outstretched hands under her own power. The documentation camera captured the moment, but it couldn't capture the emotion in the room, the tears of joy, the sense of possibility restored. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping his hands tightly. "Not just for the treatment, but for seeing me as a whole person when I couldn't see it myself." Marcus thought of Jake, and for the first time in 3 years, the memory brought more hope. Then pain. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the right help at the right time really can change everything." That night, Marcus started drafting a grant proposal for Zara's foundation idea. The research data from her treatment was impressive, but her vision for systemic change was even more compelling. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of something that could help hundreds of people facing similar challenges. For the first time since Jake's death, Marcus felt like he was truly honoring his brother's memory, not just through his medical practice, but by helping create a world where people like Jake might have different options, better support, and real hope for the future. 2 years later, Zara stood before a packed auditorium at the National Spinal Cord Injury Conference, her notes forgotten as she spoke from the heart about second chances and the power of authentic support. In the audience, she could see Marcus, beaming with pride, along with dozens of patients whose lives had been changed by the foundation they'd built together. The Phoenix Initiative, as they'd named it, had started small. Using the documentation from Zara's recovery and Marcus's research data, they'd successfully lobbied 3 insurance companies to expand coverage for electrical stimulation therapy. The foundation had helped 67 people access advanced treatments, and their support network had prevented countless others from falling into the predatory situations Zara had nearly experienced. "Recovery isn't just about walking again," Zara told the audience, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "It's about recovering your sense of worth, your belief in possibility, your connection to community." Medical treatment addresses the injury, but healing requires someone to believe in your potential, when you can't believe in it yourself. The Foundation's website now featured stories from dozens of patients, athletes and artists, students and parents, all people who had faced seemingly impossible medical expenses and found legitimate support instead of exploitation. Each story was carefully documented, not just to show medical outcomes, but to demonstrate the human impact of treating people with dignity and respect. After her presentation, Zara made her way to the Foundation's booth in the conference exhibit hall. The display featured interactive tablets where visitors could read patient stories, learn about insurance advocacy resources, and find information about protection from online predators who targeted vulnerable people seeking medical funding. "That was incredible," said Dr. Patricia Chun, who had become both a collaborator and a friend over the past 2 years. "Have you seen the sign-up numbers for your workshop on financial predator awareness?" Zara glanced at the tablet showing workshop registrations. Over 300 healthcare professionals had signed up to learn how to help their patients recognize and avoid exploitative situations. The workshop had grown from a simple presentation into a comprehensive training program now used by rehabilitation centers across the country. "Dr. Webb wanted me to tell you that the university approved his research grant," Patricia continued. "Full funding for a 5-year study on the connection between financial stress and recovery outcomes. They specifically cited your work as a model for patient-centered research." Marcus appeared at her elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied smile of someone whose long-held dream was finally coming to fruition. "Did Patricia tell you about the grant?" "She did," Zara said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Congratulations. Jake would be proud of what you've built here." Marcus had told her about his brother's full story 6 months ago during one of their late-night foundation planning sessions. Understanding Jake's struggle with depression and his ultimate decision to end his life had helped Zara appreciate the deeper motivation behind Marcus's work. It had also reinforced her commitment to addressing not just the medical aspects of spinal injury recovery, but the psychological and social challenges as well. "Actually," Marcus said, "Jake would be proud of what you've built. I just provided the medical expertise, the vision, the advocacy, the way you've transformed your worst experience into a resource for others. That's all you." Zara looked around the bustling conference exhibit hall. Representatives from medical device companies were discussing partnership opportunities with Foundation staff. Physical therapists were comparing notes on new techniques developed through their research program. Most importantly, she could see patients and families gathered around information displays, no longer facing their challenges alone. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma, one of their first Foundation beneficiaries, now walking without assistance after 18 months of treatment. "Watching your presentation online from PT, you're amazing. My therapist wants to know if the Foundation has resources for traumatic brain injury patients too." The question made Zara smile. 18 months ago, the idea of expanding beyond spinal cord injuries would have seemed overwhelming. Now, with a team of dedicated researchers, advocates, and volunteers, it felt like a natural evolution. "What do you think about expanding our scope?" she asked Marcus, showing him Emma's text. "I think," he said, watching a young man in a wheelchair animatedly discussing treatment options with one of their counselors, "that there are a lot of people out there who need someone to believe in their potential." That evening, at the Foundation's annual fundraising dinner, Zara delivered the keynote address to an audience of donors, medical professionals, and patients. She wore the same dress she'd borrowed for that disastrous restaurant meeting 2 years ago, but everything else about the situation was different. 2 years ago, I was desperate enough to consider compromising everything I valued just for a chance at recovery, she began. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that when we create systems based on dignity instead of exploitation, on investment instead of charity, on partnership instead of pity, everyone benefits. The foundation had raised over $2 million that year, but more importantly, they'd created a model that other organizations were beginning to replicate. Insurance companies were proactively expanding coverage rather than waiting for advocacy. Pressure. Medical schools were incorporating patient dignity and financial counseling into their curricula. Online platforms were implementing better protections against predatory behavior. As the evening wound down, Zara found herself on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out over the city lights. She thought about the young woman who had sat in a similar spot 2 years ago, desperate and afraid, willing to risk everything for a chance at wholeness. That young woman couldn't have imagined that her darkest moment would become the foundation for something that could help hundreds of people. She couldn't have known that the stranger who reached out with genuine help would become not just a collaborator, but a dear friend who helped her remember her own worth. Marcus joined her on the terrace, along with Patricia and several other team members. They stood quietly together, comfortable in the silence that came after a successful day's work. "You know what the best part is?" Zara said finally. "Tomorrow. Somewhere, there's someone facing the same impossible choice I faced. But now they have options I didn't have. They have people who will see their potential instead of their vulnerability. They have a chance to maintain their dignity while fighting for their recovery." She pulled out her phone and opened the Foundation's 24-hour helpline app, where trained counselors provided support and resources around the clock. 37 people had reached out for help that day. 37 people who might otherwise have fallen through the cracks or been exploited by predators. "That's why we do this," Marcus said. "One person at a time, one story at a time, until the system actually works for everyone." As they headed back inside, Zara caught her reflection in the glass doors. A strong, confident woman who had transformed pain into purpose, trauma into advocacy, desperation into hope for others. She was whole again, not because her medical treatment had been successful, but because she'd learned that wholeness came from connection, dignity, and the knowledge that her experience mattered. The girl who had once felt worthless now knew her worth was infinite, measured not in what she could do with her legs, but in what she could do with her voice, her experience, and her unwavering belief that everyone deserved a chance to rise from their ashes.